Hello. I have talked a lot about leadership. You have seen so many of my videos on leadership. You see, leadership is a romanticized topic. Everyone wants to become a leader. You rarely ever hear anyone wanting to be a great follower. The topic that I'm going to discuss today is focused on the follower. It's about followership. And unlike leadership, this is not as much of a romantic kind of concept. As I said, you typically hear people wanting to be great leaders. You rarely ever hear anyone wanting to be a great follower. There are probably thousands of programs around the world focusing on leadership. In fact, the very program that I'm part of at Purdue University, Fort Wayne is also focused on leadership. Our program is called Organizational Leadership, not Organizational Followership. So everyone wants to be a leader, but followership is typically ignored. But I hope by the end of this video, you will realize the importance of followership. In some ways, followership is even more important than leadership. You could probably imagine a world without leadership, without leaders. But it's difficult to imagine a world where everyone is leading but no one is following. So leadership cannot exist without followership. More than that, we tend to attribute a lot of organizational success to leaders. But it is ultimately the people who get things done, who accomplish things. So it is a very lopsided view of the world if we tend to attribute all the successes and failures of organizations to leaders alone. It is unfair, both to the leader as well as to the followers. Followers contribute in a major way to organizational success and, on the flip side, to their failure. Sure, a leader being at the helm of things may be given greater responsibility of the happenings in an organization. But that does not mean that followers do not have a role. So what do we mean by followership? Before we even delve deeper into the topic of followership, what do we mean by followership? In the discussions that you would have heard from me about leadership, you would remember that we define leadership as an influence process, right? A process of influencing others to attain some common goal. That's the basic idea that we have about leadership. Followership is just the opposite end of the same spectrum, you could say. So whereas leadership was the process of influencing others to attain some common goal, when we are talking about followers and followership, we are specifically talking about accepting the influence of somebody else to achieve a common goal. So, while the importance of influencing others is important, it is also important that we accept the influence of others. It is not necessarily unquestioning acceptance of influence. No, rather it is figuring out how much of acceptance there should be and how should we accept the influence so that it ultimately serves the organization or the country better. So let's talk about Hitler, for example. He is often blamed, and to a certain extent rightfully so, for the Holocaust, for the millions of people who got killed in the extermination program that he had for the Jews and other ethnicities. But can we say with confidence that it was Hitler who was solely responsible for the Holocaust? Hitler is just one person. Ultimately, people were needed to carry out the Holocaust. If there were no willing people to follow Hitler's orders, then the Holocaust would not have been possible. And I'm just giving Hitler's example here, but this applies to all such genocides. The communists, for instance, in their 100-odd years of existence, have killed more than 100 million people across the world. So be it Stalin in Russia or Mao in China or Cambodia or many other places. Can we say with 100% confidence that it was only Stalin who caused those millions of deaths in Russia? Can we say that it was only Mao who was responsible for those deaths? No, it was people who carried out those orders. So, followership, as you can imagine from this discussion so far, has a strong ethical component built into it. Leadership, of course, has an ethical component as well, but not all theories of leadership tend to emphasize the ethical aspects of leadership. But at least so far, whatever we know about followership, whatever ideas have been proposed on the topic of followership, tend to have a strong ethical component. Followers, in that sense, tend to moderate the influence of the leader. They can ultimately help in the flourishing of an organization or in the decline of an organization, depending on how they support or question the leader. In any case, with that background, let's discuss some of the different types of followers. So one very simple way of thinking about followers could be how engaged are the followers. And in fact, Barbara Kellerman, who is a professor at Harvard Kennedy School, she proposed a typology in 2008 of 5 different kinds of followers. And these followers were rated on the dimension of engagement. So depending on how engaged the followers are, we have these 5 different categories of followers. So at the lowest level, where there is the least amount of engagement, we have what are called the isolates. And at the highest level, we have the die-hard followers. So let me explain this with a slightly unrelated but relevant example. Some of you may know that I have another YouTube channel, and that is Dr. Mishra Sings. Because I am passionate about music, I tend to invest some time into music regularly in my life, and I occasionally post some songs on that particular YouTube channel. Sometimes it is more frequent, sometimes a little less, nonetheless. And currently I have about 300 followers on that channel. Now, not all of the followers, everyone who visits that channel is a die-hard follower. We actually have a spectrum of followers there. And isolate would be somebody probably who stumbled into my channel, probably because it was recommended by YouTube, or because the person came across a link that I shared on some other social media platform. Okay, the person watched the song maybe a little bit or maybe entirely, and then moved on to some other channel, watching something else. So that is the least level of engagement that you saw from a person. Then we may have somebody who is like a bystander. So in here we see a little bit more engagement. So after this particular person stumbles onto my website, this person may watch few more videos on my channel. Oh, this song was good, so let's watch some more of the songs sung by this Mishra guy, right? So that would be the kind of a person whom we probably will call a bystander. This person may also press the like button on some of the songs that he likes. So we do see some amount of engagement, some more engagement there. Then we may have the participants. And these will be people who take the time to leave comments on the videos that I post. They appreciate the work that I do, or they may have certain critical feedback. That's fine as well. But we see some kind of participation, some kind of active engagement that's happening here. So that will be the participant kind of followers. Then we may have what can be called the activists. So in the activists, we see even greater levels of engagement than what we had observed in the participants. I do have a few activists, I would say, thankfully. So I have a few friends who are avid followers of my channel. They do take the time to watch the videos, and every video that I post, almost every video, they will post some comments there. So they do a lot of active participation, and they may even share some of the videos that they liked on their own social media platforms. So they are essentially becoming like an activist. They are actively promoting my channel. But then we may have even greater levels of engagement in a follower, and they would be the die-hard followers. You rarely see die-hard followers outside the media world, outside the charismatic world of movie stars. But it is possible to see die-hard followers even in academia. And coming back to my music channel, I do have at least one die-hard follower. And that follower is my nephew. He is about 9 years old. And according to him, I'm the best singer in the world. And I should be having millions of followers, not the couple of 100, 300 followers that I have. And he plays an active role in trying to enhance my followership. So anytime, so by nephew, I mean he's my sister's son. And anytime there are guests visiting my sister's place, he will go and tell them that, hey, you should follow my uncle's YouTube. In fact, on one occasion, what he had done, he had actually taken one of the relatives who were visiting my sister's place, taken one of their phones, gone to YouTube, subscribed to my channel on their behalf so that I get more followership. So that's an example of what we would call a die-hard follower, somebody who is going to stand by you no matter what. So if we see this spectrum of the engagement, then we see these 5 different levels of followership. And most of you would agree that, at least from the leader's perspective, and maybe from the organization's perspective, we want followers who are more engaged. So we ideally would like to have more of activists and diehards than isolates and bystanders. Generally, though, just by matter of, in terms of statistics, we typically don't see as many die-hard followers, as many activists, as we may see participants, bystanders, and isolates. This will, of course, vary from domain to domain, from leader to leader. So we do see some variance, but nonetheless, this is the type of followers that we may see when it comes to varying levels of engagement. Now, one thing that I must emphasize here, even though it seems like we want more die-hard followers, it is not necessarily advisable that all our followers become die-hard followers, even though probably it is not practically possible, except in certain isolated circumstances. And that's because of a phenomenon that you may be very well aware of, and that is groupthink. Some of the major disasters that have happened in the history have been because of no follower willing to speak up against the thoughts and ideas of the leader. So blindly following the leader is not something that may be good for the organization and even for the leader. It often leads to, and it's not even good for the followers. Some major disasters, genocides, and people have been killed, even in smaller groups, because of majority turning into die-hard followers. So in this sense, it is good that we have a varying level of engagement amongst people. So if all the followers give complete 100% wholehearted die-hard support to the leader, then it can be problematic. We don't want just yes men, right? So coming back to the example of Hitler, or Stalin for that matter, or Mao, or Saddam Hussein. Were they possible because all their followers were die-hard followers? That's a question that I'm asking. I want you to think about. My answer would be not necessarily. Yes, probably they did have a substantial number of activists and die-hard followers, probably because of their charisma. But that need not be the only factor, because engagement is neither positive nor negative. It's how much of engagement that you are having, right? In fact, coming back to my YouTube music channel, I do also have a follower who, because of certain personal vendetta, is again a die-hard kind of follower, because this person makes it a point to watch every video that I post and press the dislike button. This person used to make some nasty comments as well, but then once I blocked that, those things aren't visible. But this person makes it a point to spend time watching my videos just so that he or she can dislike the video that I post. So that would be a die-hard follower in the negative direction. So a lot of active engagement that you are seeing from the follower here, but not in the direction of likes, but in the direction of dislikes. Not in the direction of supporting the leader, but in the direction of undermining the leader or challenging the leader. So that's possible as well. Although Kellerman's model do not distinguish between these different types of engagement. Kellerman's model only talks about engagement. How much of engagement are the followers making with the leader, with the purpose of the organization, right? So this then leads us to some other models, which are a little bit more complex. So while Kellerman's model was a unidimensional model, other models that I will talk about are two-dimensional. So we are taking into account at least two different dimensions, and based on that we are dividing followers into different categories. One of the oldest models of followership that was proposed was by Zalesnik, and that was way back in the 1965. He published a paper in the Harvard Business Review that proposed a 2x2 matrix, and that model provided some good insights about followership. Unfortunately, because even the field of management, the field of organizational leadership had been so focused on leadership and not much on followership, not much came out of Zalesnik's original model until the 90s, when Kelly proposed a modified version of the model, and later on Shalev proposed another model. So we will talk about those models as well. My point is, followership, even though there have been some isolated researchers who have studied followership, it is not a dominant paradigm in the management and leadership literature. I don't know the exact statistics, but easily for every 99 research papers that are published probably on leadership, you may hardly find one paper on followership. But as I mentioned in the beginning, followership is something that we need to study, because the idea of followership can provide some great insights. Also about how to become great leaders. In fact, what I would argue is that if you want to be a great leader, it's extremely important that you understand how to be a great follower first. Now, Kellerman's model, which I talked about first, also gives you a little bit of insight there, right? You obviously cannot be a great leader if you do not engage. If you are an isolate, you probably will never become a great leader, right? If you are so disengaged, if you do not engage with people or with your work, then it's unlikely you will ever become a great leader. You don't necessarily have to become a die-hard follower, but at least you need to be an activist. That should be something that excites you, that makes you passionate about, and so that you are ready to engage yourself in that particular venture that both the leader and you as a follower are passionate about. That's what die-hard followership is about, right? So both the leader and you, the follower, are strong believers in the cause that the leader is espousing. And consequently, that strong engagement from you as a follower helps you grow into a leader in the future. So from that perspective, again, studying followership is extremely important. Now, coming back to Zalesnik's model. Zalesnik was a Freudian psychoanalyst. So he was more interested into studying the personality characteristics of followers. So his research showed that there are two broad dimensions based on which we can divide followers. One is the dominance submission dimension, and the other is active passive dimension. So let's first of all talk about the dominance dimension, dominance submission dimension. So there are some people who are very controlling in nature. They want to dominate any conversation that's happening in a group. If I use McClellan's terminology, they are the people who have high need for power. Okay, they seek to climb up the dominance hierarchy. Even if they are not in leadership positions, they may not. You may be having high need for power. You may be a very domineering, controlling kind of person. Does not mean that you have a leadership position, right? So even as a follower, you may then approach everything from that controlling dominance kind of nature. That will be the approach you take. On the other end of the spectrum, you may be a very submissive person who is not necessarily trying to dominate every conversation, who is okay with being controlled by somebody else. If I talk about the big 5 personality traits, this would be a person who is probably very high on the agreeableness dimension, right? So you can imagine followers who are dominant, who are controlling, will be very different from the followers who are the submissive kind. Now let's talk about the other dimension, active versus passive. So followers who are active, we are essentially talking about they being proactive. They do not wait for instructions to be given to them to get things done. They are proactive. You could, if we take parallels with the big 5 personality traits, these will be people who are probably relatively high on conscientiousness, right? And on the other end of the spectrum, we will have followers who are passive, meaning they don't take the initiative to do things. They are not proactive. They are reactive. They do things once they are told to do something, then probably they will do it. But they do not take the initiative to do things. This then leads to a 2x2 matrix. Now, I personally do not relate with all these boxes described by Zalesnik. And to be fair, it's a very old model. But these boxes, they still provide some great insights. So let's start with the impulsive followers. They are controlling. They are, and at the same time, they are very active, proactive. Because they are not in leadership positions, so their controlling dominance kind of nature comes in form of being rebellious, okay, rebellious of the leader. And so they have this I need for power, and they are very motivated, active, proactive. So these kind of followers are called the impulsive followers. Sometimes for the leader, these followers may come across difficult followers. They seem to be creating problems for the leader. But nonetheless, you do have such followers in your organization. And then we have the compulsive followers. So they are domineering, controlling. So they have that high dominance, but they are passive. So these people, they will probably, work hard only when they feel a sense of guilt. So they're passive, right? So, well, that's, as I was mentioning before, this is a little problematic model. Compulsive doesn't exactly explain these kind of followers really well. Essentially, what is being said, though, is that they may still try to dominate you in the private. Okay. So in the active social situations, they may not take the role of dominance as much because they are not as active. But in other situations, they may still try to dominate you. They may engage in what I would call as passive-aggressive kind of methods to dominate you. So while the impulsive follower will be more active in his or her aggression, well, I'm using the term aggression in a very generic sense here, not necessarily physical aggression, of course. But here, in the compulsive followers, you will see more of a passive, aggressive way of trying to dominate you. Okay. So then we have the masochistic followers. These are extremely hardworking people because they are high on the active dimension, on the what I said, being proactive, being conscientious. But they are submissive, right? So as a leader, if you give them work, they will do it. They become like this masochistic individuals who do a lot of work. They become epitome of those victims kind of mentality. While they are doing a lot of work, they feel like they are being exploited, and they may even try to make you feel guilty for that. But what Zalesnik is saying is that this is how their personality is. They are, in a sense, masochistic in nature because they do not know any other way to interact. They are submissive individuals, so they let others dominate over them, and because they are also high on the conscientiousness part, they tend to take too much of responsibility and get things done meekly, submissively, even at cost to their own well-being or own time. Finally, we have the withdrawn followers, and they are submissive, but they're passive, so they don't do much because they're passive, right? So they will not actively question the leader or anyone in the organization. They're submissive individuals, but they're passive as well. They won't do things until they are told to. So they're withdrawn people. So anyway, I want you to think about Zalesnik's model in terms of the different kinds of people that you may have come across in your life, at your workplaces. Do these different people fit into any of these four categories? If so, then you get some insights about people here, right? Now, Zalesnik's model is not exactly a prescriptive model. So Zalesnik is not necessarily saying, giving you insights about what you should be doing to deal with these different types of followers, or but understanding somebody's personality is the first step in dealing with them effectively. So this model can potentially help you understand the psychology of certain followers, if not all followers. Some of these followers that are in your organization, or they may be your colleagues, right? They may be your co-followers. You will be able to understand them better if you understand what personality traits are driving them to function the way they are functioning. So Freudian psychology, of course, takes a very fixed kind of approach to personality, not a malleable approach to personality where you can change your personality traits easily. So at least from Zalesnik's point of view, you probably will not be able to change these people, their personality traits easily. But at least once you understand them, then you can, know what to expect from them, and probably you can work around their personality traits, right? So that was Zalesnik's model. The next model that I would like to discuss was proposed by Kelly, and this was proposed in 1992. Kelly modified essentially Zalesnik's model. If you see in the diagram here, Kelly's model also has 2 dimensions, and one of those dimensions is exactly the same as what Zalesnik had, the active-passive dimension, and they mean essentially the same as well. So active person is somebody who is proactive, and passive is somebody who is not. Active person is somebody who takes a lot of initiative, willing to work hard, conscientious, industrious kind of person. Passive person is just the opposite. But we have a different second dimension here. So while we had dominance and submission in Zalesnik's model, here we have independent critical thinking on one end of the spectrum and dependent uncritical thinking on the other end of the spectrum. So not all people are equal when it comes to intelligence. Not all people are equal when it comes to being independent and creative in one's thinking process. So this is the part that is highlighted well by Kelly. So what Kelly is saying is that you may be having followers, some followers who are independent thinkers. They do not just rely on the leader to think a certain way about any particular topic. They have their own thoughts, their own views about the particular topic. They are independent thinkers, and they are also critical thinkers, right? So they are being able to analyze the proposals of the leader critically. They can critically evaluate the merits and demerits of the leader. So that's one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, we have those followers who are not good in independent thinking. They do not necessarily have their own set of ideas, and they may not even critically evaluate what the leader is saying. They may just accept it based on whatever the leader is saying or proposing without any critical evaluation, right? So one way to think about this independent thinking, critical thinking, and dependent thinking, uncritical thinking, this dimension, which is on the y-axis here, could be in form of intelligence. So people who are more intelligent typically will have greater abilities to critically evaluate things, right? So, but intelligence is not the only dimension, I would say, that is being covered here. The dimension of openness from the big 5 personality traits is associated with independent thinking. So people who are high on this dimension of openness probably will fit more into the independent thinking, critical thinking end of the spectrum. And those who are low on openness will come into the dependent, uncritical thinking part of the dimension. Now, these are things not, these aren't the things that Kelly discussed. These are the interpretations that I am making based on my understanding of the topic. In any case, what we have here based on these 2 dimensions are 4, actually there's a 5th category as well, but at least we have 4 major categories of followers. So we have the exemplary followers. These are the kind of followers that we want in our organization. They are active, they are conscientious, they work hard, and at the same time they are independent thinkers, they are critical thinkers. So they can bring in a lot of value to the discussion that's happening, right? So they have great ideas and they are willing to work hard. That's a deadly combination in a positive sense, right? It's a great combination to have. So that's the reason they are called the exemplary followers. We want more such followers in the organization. Then we have what are called the alienated followers. These are followers who, again, are independent critical thinkers, but they are passive. Now that's a little problematic, right? Because on one hand, they have critical thoughts about what's wrong happening in the organization, what's wrong with the different policies that are formulated by the leader, but they do not necessarily do much work, right? So they become the passive followers. They're alienated from others because of this. They're always finding faults, but themselves not doing much because of their passive, because of falling into the passive part of the dimension. Then we have the conformist followers. So these are, the obedient. They are very hardworking. They are active followers, but they are dependent. They are uncritical in their thinking approach. So unquestionably, they will do whatever the leader tells them to do. Not just that, they will even take the initiative to do things, but they will not necessarily provide great positive insights about the functioning of the organization. So they will conform to whatever standards are set by the leader. So from the thinking perspective, they are complete conformist. From the action perspective, they do a lot of work. So they are the conformist kind of followers. And finally, we have the passive followers. These are the kind of followers that you do not want in your organization. And because they are passive, they do not work very hard. They have to be told to do things before they do those things. And nor do they provide any, insightful ideas, thoughts into the conversation because of the lacking in critical thinking and independent thinking. So they are the passive followers. So as is clear from the different terms that we use to categorize these different followers, the most desirable follower would be the exemplary follower and the least desirable will be the passive follower, right? So where does this fragmentist follower comes into being? You see this box in the middle. So the term fragmentist, of course, means practical. And this is a very interesting aspect of Kelly's model. I like this part of Kelly's model tremendously because he is saying that you can be a very pragmatic, very practical kind of person when it comes to following the leader. You don't necessarily have to stereotype yourself into a particular box. You don't have to get stuck in a particular box. Okay? You can switch your styles. Sometimes you could be an exemplary follower, sometimes an alienated follower, sometimes a passive follower, sometimes a conformist follower, depending on the demands of the situation. You see, exemplary followers, while they can be great asset for the organization, sometimes exemplary followers can be problematic for themselves, right? Imagine you are an exemplary follower working under Saddam Hussein. You will be in trouble if you question, if you engage in critical thinking, independent thinking in front of Saddam Hussein. You will be fired, not just metaphorically, but literally, right? So, under such circumstance, you may have the ability to engage in critical thinking and engage in independent thinking. But is it always wise, from the follower's perspective, to engage in critical thinking, to engage in those independent thinking? May not always be the case. Sometimes you may have to be very pragmatic, right? And pretend to be like a conformist follower until the situation is right, when you can then probably, act as an exemplary follower. So, pragmatism is what is being highlighted in the Fragmentist Follower. So, a Fragmentist follower has the capacity to engage in independent thinking, critical thinking. If you do not even have that capacity, of course, you will not be able to switch to becoming an exemplary follower if you don't even have the capacity to develop critical thinking abilities, right? If you do not have the capacity to think independently. So at least you need to have that capacity. But if you have that capacity, sometimes it may make sense to switch to other styles, more passive form of styles or more conformist form of styles to fit the demands of the situation. And problems need not just come from the leaders. Problems may sometimes come from your colleagues. Imagine I have a colleague who is, say, extremely envious of me and maliciously envious of me. So if I do well, if I work hard in that person's presence, then envy is going to be heightened within that person, which then could lead that person to take steps against me which will be harmful for me. So while I may be an exemplary follower, in presence of that person, it may make sense for me to take a more passive approach. Okay, so these are some of the circumstances that I can think of where Fragmentist followers will be better, at least for themselves, in terms of surviving the organization. So Kelly's model is probably the most popular followership model, and I love this model because it does provide some great insights about what you need to do in order to be a great follower and later on a great leader. So, in general, you should all strive to be exemplary followers. If you cannot become an exemplary follower, then it is going to be difficult for you to become an exemplary leader. So, that does not mean that you throw away your common sense out of the way and always act like an exemplary leader. That's the reason the importance of Fragmentist followers as well. But that should give you some idea about Kelly's model. Coming back to the ethical dimensions that I had brought in earlier while discussing Hitler, Stalin. So if there were a lot of exemplary followers under Hitler or under Stalin or under Mao, then it would have been difficult for them to create those policies that led to those mass genocides, right? Okay. But if there are only 1 or 2 exemplary followers in a group of 100 or 1,000 followers who are all majority conformist followers, then you are in trouble. Then in those situations, you may end up taking a fragmentist kind of approach. Because even if you speak up, probably, at least from a consequentialist perspective, you may not be successful in changing the status quo of things. From a deontological perspective, you may still feel that it is the correct thing to do, to question, to engage in critical thinking, to criticize the leaders' unethical policies, right? So the last model that I want to talk about is Shalleff's model. Shalleff actually was specifically interested in followership primarily because of these kind of questions that I was asking earlier about how come Hitler or other such leaders commit such horrible acts. How could people follow such toxic leaders? That's the kind of question that Shalleff was trying to answer. When you know a leader is so toxic, how could people even follow such a person? Now, in retrospection, if people are asked, okay, would you have followed Hitler? Most people would say no. But what people fail to realize is that if you and I were living in that Nazi Germany period, we probably would have done the same things that people working under Hitler did. That's a great book. I'm forgetting the title. I think it's called Ordinary Men, if I am not wrong. In any case, I will, once I remember, I'll probably add that in form of a caption, the exact title of the book. But it talks about how ordinary people like you and me committed the most horrific of actions during the Nazi regime. So Shalleff was trying to understand this, and he proposes a model which is again similar to the other models that I have discussed so far, but slightly different. So Shalleff's model is more of a prescriptive model. He is not bringing into account any personality traits here. He is focusing more on actions. So the 2 dimensions that he has here are challenge and support. So challenge dimension is similar to what Kelly had in form of independent critical thinking and dependent uncritical thinking. Similar but not same. When Kelly spoke about independent thinking and critical thinking, he was talking more in terms of ability to think independently, more ability to think critically, right? And the assumption is that if you have those abilities, then you will engage in more critical thinking, more independent thinking. Here in Shalleff's model, the challenge dimension is focusing on, do you actually challenge the leader? Irrespective of whether you have the ability or not is not taken into account here. Because you may have the ability, but you may still not challenge the leader, right? So high challenge is you are challenging the leader on things that the leader does wrong, that the leader is doing incorrect. Low challenge means you do not challenge the leader at all. You passively agree to whatever the leader tells you to do or tells others to do. You do not challenge. And then we have the second dimension, which is that of support. High support is you actively, vociferously support the leader. You would be reminded of the die-hard kind of follower, which I talked about in Kellerman's model, right? The activists or the die-hard kind of followers, like my nephew, who is always there to support me. So high, strong support. And the low support, who is not at all willing to support me. So these two dimensions then create 4 different categories. So we will start with, should I say, partner. That's the ideal form of follower based on Shaleff's model. So a partner is a person, is a kind of follower who both challenges the leader and supports the leader based on the merits of the different policies, based on the merits of the different decisions that the leader is taking. So if it's a problematic decision, then the follower will challenge it. If it's a great decision, if it's an ethical decision, then this particular follower will actively, strongly, vocally support this leader as well. So you see a lot of high challenge as well as high support behaviors from such a follower. They are your partners. Then we have the implementers who do not challenge but support. Okay, so they will speak vocally when the leader does things right that they agree with, but they will not openly challenge the leader when the leader does anything wrong. And these implementers, you can realize, are a big problem. One of the big reasons why those genocides happened. There were a lot of implementers. People did not challenge them. And then there were the resource people. They neither challenge nor support. So they are neither vocal with their challenge nor vocal with their support. They just quietly do what they are told to do. They become a great resource for any kind of autocratic leader. For any leader for that matter. But if we are talking about these tyrants that we had, then these tyrants derived a lot of support, energy from such resource category of followers. Even if they are not vocally supporting the leader, by not challenging, they are implicitly supporting, right? So they become major resource. And majority of the followers probably will fall into this category. And lastly, we have the individualists. These are the followers who challenge the leader, but do not support. And this can be a little bit problematic, as you can imagine. You are only finding faults with the leader, not supporting the leader on the things that the leader does right. So in essence, then you become like some kind of nagging person in a couple's relationship, right? And no one likes people who are always nagging, always finding fault. Again, this will be a slight distraction, but if you have seen my video on love relationships and the kind of relationships that last and the kind that fail, John Gottman has done a lot of studies there. So there needs to be at least 5 positive emotional interactions for every 1 negative interaction for a relationship to work. The same would apply even in case of leadership followership relationship. So if a follower is only finding faults, not engaging in sufficient amount of positive, supportive kind of interactions, then such followers will not be respected by either the leader or, for that matter, even by the colleagues. They become the individualists, right? So in fact, if I mix up this different lines of research, so for your challenge to work really well, you should also be very vocal in supporting the leader when the leader does things right. And if you are not supporting adequately, if you are only finding faults, you will not be taken seriously. You will be considered to be a biased person who has his or her own personal vendetta against the leader. Like, I was mentioning, in case of my YouTube music channel, there is this one person who is always negative, right? So then you stop taking that person seriously. If the person provides both positive as well as negative, when I do things positive, the person provides positive feedback. When I don't do as well a job, the person provides negative feedback. Then that person gets taken seriously. Otherwise, you don't get taken seriously. You get blocked. So this is what would happen even in organizations. So Shaleff's model is a great model, and it has a lot of ethical dimensions to it as well, as you can imagine. The primary Shaleff's model is a very prescriptive model. So Shaleff is encouraging all the followers to work more like partners, where you are challenging when there is a need to challenge the leader, and when you are supporting where there is a need to support the leader. If you do that properly, then you will become a great follower. That's the kind of follower that organizations need. That's the kind of followership that helps prevent the kind of genocides, the kind of horrible things that has been committed in the history. And again, we are not just talking about genocides, even corruption within government organizations, within corporations like Enron, or any of the other major corruption would not have happened if there were enough number of partners. Partners would be people who actively challenge the leader for their incorrect decisions and also actively support the leader for their correct decisions. Now, the additional point that I'm adding here is that for your challenges to be taken seriously, you should support at least 5 times more, right? Now, you're not necessarily counting those proportions, but it is extremely important that you support the right decisions as well. So those are the main followership models that I wanted to discuss with you. The key thing to remember is this. The traditional view is that leaders make things happen in organizations, that leaders are the root cause of both the good things and bad things that happen in organizations, in countries, in religions. But that's not completely the case. The followers play a very important role. If there are adequate number of these good followers, you could call them partners, you could call them exemplary followers, you could call them, different terminologies can be used for different models. But if there are adequate number of these exemplary or partner kind of followers, then we will be having organizations that are more successful, more ethical, and we will see less of cruelty in this world. And if you are a person who is striving to be a leader, the best place to start is to strive first to become an exemplary follower, if I'm using Kelly's typology. Exemplary Follower, or for that matter, even Fragmentist Follower. Or if I'm using Shalluf's model, try to be a great partner. And that will ultimately help you become much more effective a leader, much more great a leader. So with that, I will stop this talk. Thank you.